Hello there, McCarp here as usual. Today I want to talk about a concept known as the quote-unquote burning times that many new pagans and witches may hear of upon entering the community. I assume that everyone has heard of the world-famous witch trials, points in time where witchcraft was punishable by death and used as a reasoning to spread paranoia. The most famous of these took place in the British colony of Salem, Massachusetts in the 17th century. That being said, a lot of witch trials occurred all across the globe, particularly in Europe and European colonies. French and German witch trials were far more gruesome and aggressive than British trials, but we don't often hear of them, at least in the English-speaking world. The concept of the burning times is a lot like this, except it pretty much combines all of the witch trials into one massive, bloody period that took place from the Dark Ages to the 19th century, where millions of witchcraft practitioners were systematically slaughtered. Some place the number of dead witches as high as 9 million. Essentially, it just would have been a good old genocide against witches. Thanks, ancient Hitlers. That is, at least it would have been. As in, if these so-called burning times actually occurred. Which they really didn't. If I'm going to be totally frank, the concept of the burning times is just an exaggerated story of the witch craze and is used as a form of self-victimization by certain pagans and witches. For what reason? Don't come asking me. Ask the ones who actually believe this stuff happened. Granted, some may be believing it out of misinformation, which we all know is everywhere nowadays. I'm not saying everyone who believes in the concept of the burning times uses it for self-victimization, but a notable portion unfortunately do. But wait, you cry. How do you know that they didn't happen? Well, I do a little thing called reading historical articles and being a nerd. Even people with potato sacks for heads have brains. Early courts kept records. They had to. Even in monarchies, that's how the law worked. They had to keep record of people who were tried, who were questioned, where prisoners were sent to, and what they were accused of, sentences given to criminals, etc. It's largely the same thing today in nations with judiciary systems, which is almost all of them which aren't authoritarian. If you look at the actual number of trials in an area and the amount of people who were found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to death, then move on to the next area, and until you have a rough estimate of most nations' death tolls, you can actually crunch the numbers. Insert a wee bit of math, and we get an estimate that leans to about 200,000 casualties. On the high end. Historians with lower estimates lean around 40,000 casualties. Now, that's still a pretty high number, but it isn't that high compared to other mass deaths and genocide in history. Keep in mind that this number is counting all casualties, not just misaccusations or those accused of witchcraft for reasons unrelated to witchcraft, both of which were common, but I'll get to this later. This being said, the numbers ranging in the 9 millions didn't just show up out of nowhere. That came from a little group of people called witch hunters. During the witch craze, this was a pretty legitimate occupation. Essentially, you just had to accuse people of witchcraft, and the local magistrates would pay you a monthly wage. The most successful was a man named Matthew Hawkins, who accordingly had 300 women executed in East Anglia during the English Civil War of 1645 and 1646. Now, obviously, leading to the deaths of a few old women now and then wasn't a thing that would get you good pay. So, if you just bumped up the numbers a bit, make the witchcraft threat seem a little bigger than it actually was, it would help out your economic situation, you know? And apparently the best number possible just happened to be 9 million. Before looking into court records, this is the number historians decided to go by, just because it was the only thing available. That's how it ended up in the whole burning times thing. Just for reference, though, I want to mention that roughly 6 million Jewish people were killed during the Holocaust, along with an estimated 7 million Soviet civilians and 3 million Soviet soldiers during World War II. The Third Reich also killed about 1.3 million Polish civilians during the air invasion of Poland, and that isn't to mention all the other ethnic groups they brutally attacked. If 9 million witches were killed during the so-called burning times, it would be a tragedy dwarfed only by the Holocaust and Second World War. You'd probably have learned about these numbers in school. I also want to point out that very few witches were actually targeted during these witch crazes. Leading factors in accusing people of witchcraft were paranoia and just general dislike of them. The accuser was either paranoid or was trying to frame the other person. Very rarely was there actual evidence of a claim of witchcraft. I mean, seriously. The quote-unquote evidence for being a witch was having pets, being single, being old, being a widow, and most worryingly, being a woman. To be frank, it was more about misogyny than anything else. I mean, don't get me wrong. A fair amount of men were executed for being witches too, but that was usually due to paranoia. There was definitely religious oppression in Christian Europe, but the witch trials definitely weren't just witchcraft trials. Besides, a lot of claims of witchcraft were made against people of Christian beliefs, namely Catholicism and Protestantism, which did make up for a fair amount of deaths as well. Long story short, the burning times is just a concept used as self-victimization for pagans and witches rather than an actual event. Historically, it is much better to call a period the quote-unquote witch craze like normal people do. It's simply more accurate and more honest than this concept of a genocide trumped only by the Holocaust that never actually occurred. Even if the burning times were useful to people of our beliefs, we should not play the oppression card. We are a group of strong individuals who have the will to follow paths that are seen as corrupt, abnormal, or devilish to a number of more common religions, and have misinformation spread about them near constantly. We could easily spread just as much misinformation by using the burning times as propaganda and claiming that we've been oppressed for centuries, which we have in select cases. Should we? Well, that's for the majority to decide, but I firmly believe we shouldn't. Still, that is for a whole different rant. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something from this video. Wishing you a beautiful morning, evening, and night wherever you are. This has been Macabre. Till next time.